So we are in session number 3, which covers Job chapter 19, verses 19 through 29. And we're coming to a point now in the story where Job's friends are coming around and they're kind of, again, pointing the finger at him saying, well, this wouldn't have happened to you if, you'd been living a righteous life. If you must have some sin. God is punishing you. God is on you because you deserve it. And, you need to confess whatever it is and you need to get it right. And Job is saying, no, that's not the case. I've been faithfully serving God. My life is right with God. And, God is putting me through this for reasons of his own. And, and he is, again, pushing back on them. But, Job is going through, again, let's just paint this picture. I mean, he's been through horrendous physical situation, right? Because he has had his health touched and he has boils all over him and he's in poor health. And we're going to see his health is even more diminished here. He's had the emotional stress of the loss of all of his livelihood, all of his goods, and all of his family have either died or turned on him at this point. Now his friends have turned on him and are not supporting him. He has been isolated and is alone in this trial that he's going through. And he has no resources. So the devil has not only been attacking him, the devil is, again, a tricky guy, right? So, the Lord said you can do anything you want to him except take his life. And the devil has attacked Job on every front possible: physical, emotional, mental, relational, on and on it goes. He has come at Job from every single angle, trying to wedge Job's faith out and make it fail in some way. And so when you think about that and the trials that we go through in our life, a lot of times, we might have a tragedy where we get struck in one area. Maybe it's a health issue, and because it's expensive, it affects our financial issue, and because it's maybe health, it affects our mobility and our ability to go out and earn a living, and so it can be very similar to what Job's going through. But usually our whole family and loved ones rally around us and try to help us and support us, right? And that is not happening with Job. They're doing the opposite. His wife said, you should just curse God and die. And she's like, you just need to give up on your faith in God, and you need to just, and then the friends are like, oh, well, it has to be your fault. They don't have any understanding that God is doing the work in Job's life with a purpose, right? Because they're only looking at the physical side. They're not looking at the spiritual side. They're not looking at the fact that God is in control of Job's life and has a purpose and plan. And that purpose is to go through this valley, right? So we all want to trust God on the mountaintops, but again, if you're in the valley, then that's on you. You got to get something straightened out there, and you don't want to trust God now because, I don't like valleys, right? And so I noticed a little poll on Instagram. It just made me think about this, where people are asking, do you like the woods or the mountains? Do you like the sea or the mountains? Do you like the beach or the mountain? And on every one of those, it was mountains was the winner. So predominantly people like the mountaintop experience, right? And so, again, these guys are thinking because Job was on a mountaintop experience, right? Job was a very wealthy man, extremely wealthy, blessed with a big family, blessed with a lot of land and goods and a prosperous life, and had probably anything that he wanted, he probably had, because God's hand was on his life, God's blessing was on his life. The devil pointed that out in the beginning dialogue, that you have placed a hedge around Job, you have prospered him, you have blessed him. And so Job was in a very mountaintop experience in his relationship and in his life, right, with God. And so this has all been turned upside down. So think about that too. Being in a place of prosperity in every area of your life, and then being flipped into a position of destitution in every area of your life. How would you handle that dramatic shift like that? And so the emotional toll on Job is probably just as severe as the physical toll that's been on Job, if not more so, because you internalize and you analyze and say, okay, what did I do wrong? How did I mess up? Is God mad at me? Has God forsaken me? All these kinds of things start going through your mind, and you begin to start doubting your faith, doubting your walk with God, all these kinds of things. And that's what the devil is trying to do, is to get him to doubt his relationship and position with God. But that wasn't the case. Job's friends assumed that his circumstances indicated that he was at fault for the suffering and that he needed to repent. But Job knew that that wasn't the case. He knew that he had been faithful. He knew he was still trusting God. He was still believing in God. He was still obeying God, right? Because again, Job can't be called a faithful man if he's not an obedient man, because part of being faithful is being obedient. So again, if Job is a faithful person, we know that he's an obedient person to the things that God has called him to. And so Job ultimately believed God allowed this suffering to fall on him and had providentially ordained it. You know what that is? That's real faith. See, as believers in the New Testament, we know, again, that there'll be trials, tribulations, and testings of our faith, right? That has been providentially decreed for the life of a believer. And that, knowing that, faith in God includes accepting that in our walk and in our life when it happens, right? And so again, Job is not experiencing anything that we can't experience in our walk and that hasn't already been promised to be a part of our walk to some degree. Now, that's the deal here. Job got 100% test, right? I mean, he had the hardline test. God doesn't always test all of us equally and in the same way, but he will test us in proportion to our faith in him, right? Because the whole point of that test is to mature and to grow and expand our faith, right? And so how do we do that? When you want to grow and expand a muscle, you exercise it, you stretch it, you tear it, you build it over again, and God does that with our faith. He pushes, pulls in that area of our life to build, develop, and grow and stretch that faith and turn it into a more dominant force in our life, right? And when we see God work in our life and take us through those trials and those tests and those things, and we see God faithful in the outcome of those situations, it's easier to trust him the next time. Our faith grows a little bit. It deepens a little bit. It matures a little bit. And so the next test that comes our way, we're more apt to trust God a little more fully than we did in the previous one because we experienced his faithfulness in the last one, right? And so it is that building of our faith that God is doing in this exercise. And again, it is for our benefit and for his glory that he does these things. But Job's friends, even though that's what God was doing, they did not see that. They did not understand that. They did not expect that. Because obviously their relationship with God was not on the same plane and on the same level of maturity as Job's, right? And so they were looking at it from a more carnal or more physical viewpoint instead of a spiritual viewpoint, and more like, well, God's paying you back for something that you've done instead of God is growing your faith and bringing himself glory. They were missing the spiritual aspect of what God was doing in Job's life. And sometimes believers today do that. God's doing something for a purpose in your life, and it is difficult and you don't really like it and you may not want to accept it. But again, it is for your good and his glory that God is doing it because you are under the sovereign and divine control of God. And his providential care includes some of these things to mature you and to leave you in a better place than you were when it began. All things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. There's nothing that gets outside of the all, right? All things. Even the things that are difficult, that like Job is going through, that come into our lives are for our good, right? All of them. All of them. I had my daughter, one of my daughters has now said that I am accident prone. I don't believe that, but I do put my body into situations where it is jeopardized and gets damaged regularly my whole life. So I was switching out some guns in one of my gun cabinets, and I put one gun in, I was moving some things around, and I turned to get something, and a shotgun fell out. Right on the end of my toe. 2 toes, actually, but. So I'm going to lose 2 toenails. Let's just say that. It's an ugly deal. It's not good, right? But here's the reality. God uses even little things like that in your life to mold you and conform you into the image of his son. Because I could respond in different ways to that particular event in my life, right? I can get angry, I could get mad, I could get frustrated, I could get a lot of things. And some of those things I did to some degree, I'll just say right now. But the reality is God uses, the one that God uses in my life on a daily basis is traffic. Traffic. To demonstrate my lack of conformity to the image of Christ in the area of patience and long suffering, right? Literally, daily, that is a challenge for me, especially at certain times coming off on Telshore where my office is, right? And so again, God uses these things in our life it should be an opportunity for us to examine how we are responding to what happens in our life that God has allowed. Because after all, he's in control of our life down to every second, every moment, every event, everything that's going on. There's no chance, right? God didn't wind the world up and let it go. The God who created is the God who is sovereign and in control of all things. And he uses these things in our life, little things, big things. We're looking at big things today in the life of Job. But all of these things work in our life and are for a purpose. If we are if we would just be diligent to examine them and apply them correctly, right? And so God will use different things. He'll use different people. There are different people that come into our lives that cause maybe strain or that are difficult to deal with, but it is an opportunity for us to demonstrate Christ-likeness in having patience and love with this person, even though they're difficult or we don't necessarily agree with them or like them or whatever, because I wanted to tell you, Jesus is patient with us, and we have a lot of problems, you and I, but he still loves us. And he's still kind and long-suffering and tender-hearted and merciful, and all these things that we need to be if we're going to be Christ-like to those that we come in contact with who may rub us the wrong way or be different than we are, right? And so, again, that was extra. We're going to pick up now in verse 19. And here's where Job is. So, again, Satan's attack on Job went beyond the material and the physical. It also was an attack on the emotional and the psychological. The emotional and the psychological. And sometimes we lose sight of that. And like Job's friend, we can be insensitive to what others are going through. We may not see anything physical. So like, me, Mr. Tough Guy, I am hard on these wimpy guys that I work with sometimes because they have something happen to them, like they hurt their neck or whatever, and that changes their course and their direction where that doesn't impact me, right? But there are other things that do impact me that they may not see and that they may be strong in. So we're all gifted differently. We're all equipped differently. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. And what impacts me may not impact you, and what impacts you may not impact me. And so one of the things we need to realize is, I'm not an emotional guy, right? In that sense where I get worked up about things, but other people do. And so again, their trial may be engineered in the way that they're made. And they may be going through a trial that is impacting them in a big way that may not impact me at all. I might say, suck it up, buttercup, right? Because I'm not built the same way. I don't think the same way. But the reality is I need to be, like Job's friends, not insensitive to the fact that they may be going through a trial that is devastating to them and the way that God made them and the way that they are and their attitude and their attributes and their experiences. Because they've been crafted and molded to be them, not to be me. Right? And so we need to be sensitive. Job's friends are very insensitive, and it impacted Job. Here's what he says: all my best friends despise me. So this is the way he's feeling about the support group that he has, right? He's not feeling that he has a support group. It's like none of them understand. Matter of fact, they despise my position and my situation and my case, and they think it's all because I've brought it on myself. They have no empathy. They have no sympathy. They have no understanding. They have no comprehension of the fact that that I've been faithful to God. They've seen my life modeled out before them, but they're all accusing me of something that isn't there, right? I mean, they've all been around Job for a long time, and they've seen him live his faith, right? But they're all denying that Job was a faithful guy and saying that he must have some fault or failure. And so again, they are undermining his character. They're undermining his integrity. They're undermining his testimony that he's lived out in front of him. I mean, they're just discounting everything there is about Job instead of supporting him. So as believers, we need to be careful because it's easy to be critical, right? And it's easy to be judgmental of other people when they are going through things in their life. Well, if you'd have just done this, or if you were more faithful here, or if you had, planned ahead, or if you had taken precautions, it's so easy to do that and be judgmental of others because they didn't handle a situation exactly the way we think they should or we would, right? And so that's not our place. In the New Testament, it's very clear. Jesus said it this way: who are you to judge another man's servant? We don't know what God's doing in their life. We don't know what God has put them through. There's a lot of people. I watched another video this week about a man who was, he's a Korean that naturalized here in the country, and he served in the army for 30 years, and he went to war for this country. And he was talking about how people judge him and say, well, you don't look like American. You don't, you're not as patriotic as you should be, and blah, 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 blah. And he goes, I don't normally do this. He goes, but this is enough, and I'm going to show you something. And he is a city councilman in a city in California. And he unbuttoned his shirt, and he had the giantest injury right here across his chest from being in the war. He goes, is this patriotic enough for you? And so we don't know he looked like, just a normal average guy in his shirt and tie, very well dressed, very well spoken. But he was being judged on his patriotism, right? And nobody knew that he'd nearly given his life, and he definitely had given a big portion of his health for this country, right? And he was serving, even after he got out of the military, serving his community. So again, just to give you an example, we don't know what other Christians are going through, what other believers. We don't know where they're at in their spiritual walk with God. We don't know if they're in their infancy of their faith or in the senior maturity of their faith or somewhere in between. We don't know where they're at. We don't know what God is doing. We don't know what they've been through. We don't know their history, their background. We don't know where they were at in their life before they came to Christ and the damage that did to them mentally, psychologically, physically, and how God is working them through that. Our charge is to love one another. How will people know that you are my disciples and that you have love one for another? Not judging them, loving them, right? Not being critical, not analyzing them, not holding them up to a false standard that you create in your own heart and mind that you think every believer and Christian should live up to, but loving them the way that Christ loved them. How did he love them? He gave his life for them, and no greater love has any man than this. So we have to learn, even from the example of Job, how not to be as a believer, how not to be when we come alongside somebody and try to help them. A lot of times people say, I'm going to try and help this person, but what they really mean is I'm going to come in and judge you, and I'm going to criticize you, and I'm going to give you instruction because you're not smart enough to do it on your own. It's not about help. It's about, trying to prove how smart or how good we are. And that is not help. And that is not love, right? And so people need to be careful about how they approach people. But Job is very devastated because these are his close friends. He said, my best friends. He's not talking about his peripheral relationships. He's talking about his close, intimate relationships treated him this way. And he goes on to say in the verse, and those that love me. His wife, right? His wife did that to him. So this is not going to be a lesson on marriage, but that's not how marriages should work in a Christian home. Right? And so it's also easy to do, though, because it's easy to point out and criticize the flaws in your spouse and those that are closest to you than it is to love them. Right? And so we have to be careful of that. And so again, they have turned against me, he says. They despise me, and those that I love have turned against me. So this attack, so remember this, the devil is tricky. This attack wasn't just on the surface. This attack was in depth, and it was on every front, and it was intense. And so Job is under this pressure of this trial, and it is a large magnitude of pressure that he's going through. He has nowhere to turn except his faith in God, right? That's it. That is also sometimes the point of the trials that God puts us through, that we get to the end of ourselves, and we get to the end of our resources, and we turn to him. Sometimes that's the point of the trial. Sometimes that's the point of the exercise, to build and hone our faith, that we say, I have nowhere to turn but God, my faith in God. There's nobody to help me. There's nobody to get me out of this mess. There's nobody that can stop this situation. There's nobody that can give me the answer, the money, the health, the whatever. It's in God's hands. And that's the point that Job is at. He has nowhere to turn. The devil in this trial had the ability, by God's sovereign, providence in allowing this to happen this way, to isolate Job down to where there was nothing but his relationship with God. And so again, sometimes that's what God does. He gets us to turn and look at him. He says here in verse 20, this is the toll that it's taken on him. So he's describing what he's going through in the situation, and now he's going to describe the toll that it took on him. He says, my skin and my flesh cling to my bones. So you think Job has been eating and living it up since all this has taken place? He has probably lost his appetite. He is probably, I had a time in my life where I was going through a lot of stress, and you know what happened to me? I lost a lot of weight, and then I started losing a lot of hair, and that's not a good thing. And when I got from under that stress, my weight went back up and my hair stopped falling out. Isn't that amazing how physically that kind of thing can do damage to your body? And so that's where Job's at. He is skin and bones. He's lost a bunch of weight, and he's just, hanging in there, barely hanging in there on the physical realm, right? And so stress can wear you down. He says, I have escaped with only the skin of my teeth. So all that's taken place, the wreck of his own personal health, the wreck of his life, he has nowhere to live. His house is blown down. This guy's, everything is gone. It's like a bomb went off in his life and there's nothing left, right? I don't know where he's living. I don't know if he's, out in a tent, or if he's under a tarp, or if he's laying next to the rubble, under a tree. We don't have any idea, but we know that he has nothing left because all of it was taken or destroyed. And so again, he says, I escaped by the skin of my teeth. Job's emotional and physical suffering witnessed to the fact that he had narrowly escaped with his own death. And again, even though it had taken a physical toll, here's the reality. Even though it took an emotional toll in verse 19, Job remained faithful. In verse 20, even though it had taken a physical toll, here's the reality. Job remained faithful. That's an amazing testimony in the life of Job. Verse 21 and verse 22 says this, have mercy on me, my friends. Have mercy for God's sake, who struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? And so again, he's like, man, can't you guys leave me alone? God has the right to do whatever God wants to do in my life, but this is not your place to take a pound of flesh, right? And, ease up a little bit, he's saying here. He says, other aspects of Job's trial considered other aspects we want to consider about Job's trial are this: its longevity and its intensity. This is also something that's taking place in Job's life that wasn't quick and instantaneous. This is going on for a while. It's going on long enough that where people can circle around and criticize and evaluate and put their 2 cents in. It's going on long enough where Job's health is failing. It's going on long enough where he's destitute and has no recourse, nowhere to recover from all of this thing that's going on in his life, right? There's no solutions. There's no answers. There's nothing about this that is improving. It is at the low ebb, that is low water mark, and it has stayed there, and he is stuck down here. And these guys, even though he's at this place and there's no end in sight, they're still piling it on, right? They're still piling it on to him. And he's like, give me a break. God has done this to me. God's allowed this in my life. Do you have to do it too? Do you have to be a part of the trial? Do you have to be on top of me, beating me down when God has already brought me low, right? And so he's kind of pushing back on them a little bit. And then verse 23, Job says this, and this is a strange request, but I think the reality of this, Job's faith, he knows he's right with God, and he knows that this can be an example to people in the future of what it looks like to trust God no matter what the circumstance of your life is. And so Job says this. He makes this wish. He says in verse 23, I wish that my words were written down, that they were recorded on a scroll, or were inscribed in a stone forever by an iron stylus and lead. He's like, I wish everyone could see what's happened to me and hear my story and see my situation. And guess what happened? God did that for Job. Here's what you need to know, that even in the midst of the trials and tribulations going on in your life, God hears and answers prayers. And God does for us what only God can do. Job's story has been recorded through all of time since the time it happened, and we have it today as an example of what faithfulness to God looks like despite the circumstances of our life. God preserved Job's story for everyone. That's fascinating to me. That is really a fascinating aspect of this that we don't really focus on very much. That number one, God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That God started this thing in Job's life. And that God knew that Job was going to be faithful. And God is broadcasting Job's faithfulness throughout the generations to everyone who has ears to hear. See, God had a plan all along that Job's example would not just impact Job, would not just bring God glory then at this time, but it would impact believers who are trusting God with their lives throughout all of your Christianity. And God would continue to get glory because of Job's life so long ago and the impact and the influence he has on believers going forward. See, God looks at the eternal perspective, the big picture. Job can only see what's happening in his life right then and there. But God had bigger plans for Job and for Job's influence and for Job's testimony to be way beyond the life that Job lived in his physical body, right? God had bigger things in mind for Job. God used him in a bigger and mightier way than Job could have ever managed on his own, serving God in his own lifetime. And so again, God may have a plan in your life that involves more than what you can see, more than what will take place in your lifetime. We talked about this the other day about grandkids. May not see the impact of you on your grandkids in your lifetime, but there might be an impact from you in their lifetime down the road. You don't know. You don't know how God is going to use you through time and eternity. Faithfulness to God will always have a reward and a blessing attached to it. It doesn't mean that it's for you. It might be for someone else. Your faithfulness may end up being a blessing in the life of someone else down the road. I think about my dad in that case and his faithfulness to the ministry and the impact that he's had on the lives of others and will have on the lives of generations down the road, because entire families who were lost are now saved, right? And they're having kids and they know the Lord, and they're having kids and they know the Lord. Those kinds of things. And so again, we want to always make it about us when something's happening, right? But it could be about something bigger than us that God is doing with us that we can't see. So that's another reason to trust him. To trust him. And so he did this for Job. In the midst of the trial, God answered a prayer that Job had, or a wish that Job had. Trust God no matter our circumstances. His desire for his words to stand as a monument, to be preserved, to give wisdom to those who came after him. And the monument of Job is this: trust God no matter what, right? That's what we've learned. And so verse 25 and 27 says this: but I know that my Redeemer. Now this is an amazing thing right here too, because this is pre most of the Bible, right? But again, God and Job had a relationship. And God always speaks in some way to those he has a relationship with, right? Started with Adam, walked with Adam in the cool of the Garden of Eden, had communion and fellowship. So on every front, those who follow God, God in some way, in that dispensation, speaks to them, communes with them, illuminates them, directs them, and guides them. And he has done that with Job. And so here's what Job says, which is very prophetic, which is amazing in light of the fact that he had no concept of a Messiah, no concept of God's Son, no concept of the Redeemer, and all these things. But this is what comes out of Job's faith in God, right? And what God had revealed to him. He says this, "But I know that my Redeemer lives. Even if I die here in this situation and this thing that God is putting me through, here's what I know. My Redeemer lives." My Redeemer. Look at the term that he uses there, right? The person who will save me, regardless of my situation, is alive, right? And he goes on to say, "And at the end will stand on the dust." On this earth, he will be here. My Redeemer will stand on this dust, on this earth. He will be here. He will come here. And he goes on to say, "Even after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see my God in my flesh." So he didn't know or understand the concept of Jesus the Redeemer, but he understood God the Redeemer, and Jesus and God are one. Right? And he says, "I will see God in my flesh." So even though my flesh is destroyed, even though I die, my flesh is gone and is no more, on this earth, I will, in my flesh, see my God and my Redeemer. That's an amazing statement, right? And so then he goes on to say, "I will see him myself. My eyes will look at him, and not as a stranger." How could Job say that? Because Job had a relationship with God. Remember when we've talked about why did God create Adam and Eve? To have a relationship with him. Why did God redeem mankind? To restore relationship with him. What did Job have with God? He had a relationship with him. You see, this whole exercise is not about, again, anything other than God desiring to have a relationship, an intimate relationship where you know him and he knows you, like Job just described right here. I know him and he's not a stranger to me. God wants to have an intimate relationship with you. That's the whole point of the exercise. Determined by him before the foundation of the world, that he would pour his love out on you, his great love on you, not just the world as a whole, but you as an individual. You who he knows the very number of hairs on your head. You whom he would die for. You. No greater love. This relationship is couched and housed in the greatest love possible for you. Believers need to lock onto that. It changes the dynamic of our relationship with God when we understand the depth of his love for us. Not us collective. There is a love for us collective, but for us, for me. God's love for me. God's love for Job was what was sustaining him through this trial and tribulation. God's love for you will sustain you through the trials and tribulations of your life. He loves you. And while he puts you through these trials and tribulations to grow your faith, what grows alongside of your faith, if you're a healthy believer and a true believer, is your love. Your love for God is also what is being developed. Let me just tell you something about this. Think about Job when he comes out on the other side of this trial. And God has brought him through. And God has been faithful. And God restores him. And God lifts him up and elevates him for all of time and eternity to see, and for believers that come after him in his footsteps to see and to emulate, and God honors him, and then God does exactly what Job says, and he has a face-to-face relationship with God for all of eternity, and Job is now experiencing that. What do you think happened to the love that already Job had for God? Don't you think it grew, and that it developed, and it became all that it can be? It's the whole point of the exercise, is God is helping you because you're dead in your trespasses and sin. You know what we want to love? We want to love ourselves, and we want to love sin. God works in our life to change the direction of our affection. And that it works through our faith, and it builds into love so that our relationship with God is in that restored position that it was meant to be all along. He loves us, we love him. We love him because why? He first loved us. Right? So God is engineering this love relationship in your life. Despite the fact that we rejected him, rebelled against him, turned our back on him, became the enemies of God, by our own choice and by our own free will, God works this miraculous work of mercy in our life and of love. It's an amazing thing. The story of Job is a love story of God loving one of his own to do great and mighty things in his life. And God has the same kind of love and will do the same kind of great and mighty things in the life of every believer. Every single one. We're all special to God. We've all been bought with a price. We all have an obligation to love God and to glorify God with our body and the way that we live our life in relationship to the reality of what God has done and what God is doing. I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm just telling you, that's the whole theme of the Bible. It is the absolute theme of Christianity, is the absolute prime directive of how we are to walk through this life as believers. It is about loving God, loving others. Period. End of story. Everything evolves around that. Everything points to that. Everything comes out of that. Everything goes back to that. Everything is about love for God expressed through love for others. Love. So that's why when we go through these trials, it helps us hone in on that reality. So he goes on. This is where Job's faith rested, and it allowed him to trust God with his life. He knew that no matter what happened, even if his life ended in this situation, because he doesn't know if the trial is going to go even farther, right? He doesn't know that God said you can't take his life. You can touch Job any way you want, but you can't take his life. Job doesn't know that. Job wasn't a part of that conversation. Job is probably thinking that the trial is going to end in me being dead because this has not been looking good and I've been going that direction for a while now, right? So he's probably assuming that worst case scenario is I'm dying, right? This is how I'm getting out of this deal. But even if I die, God's still going to be faithful. And so that's where Job's faith rested, in the faithfulness of God. Our faith needs to rest in the faithfulness of God. It's not about what you and I can do or willing to do, able to do. It is not about that. It is about the faithfulness of what God does, what God has said, what God has promised, what God is capable of because he's omnipotent, and what he knows about our lives because he's omniscient. And all those things, all those attributes of God that we talk about from time to time, they're all working in conjunction with the reality of what God is doing in our life. All the emphasis and focuses of God's attributes are involved in the process of what he is doing in our lives. He's not half paying attention, right? You know, I can tune things out when you have 4 daughters in the house and a wife and a bunch of barking dogs growing up. You learn, if you're going to be able to think and not go stir crazy, to tune out things around you, right? So I can absolutely be in a room and not hear anything that's going on around me, right? I can do it. And sometimes my wife will have to be like, hey, you're not paying attention. I'm like, you're right. Absolutely not paying attention. And so, you know, here's what we need to understand. God's not like that. He's not paying attention to your life sometimes, part of the time, because he's spread too thin and there's too much going on. There's too many moving parts, too many people to save and redeem, too much lives to intervene in, too many prayer requests to answer. That's not happening with God. It's not happening with God. He is completely capable of focusing on us individually and meeting every need that we have. But my God shall, not might, or possibly can, my God shall supply all of your needs according to his riches or his resources in glory by Christ Jesus. See how that all fits together? See how the story of Job lays perfectly in with the New Testament? See, remember, I'll say this again. The Old and New Testament, we've split it up that way. It's one story of God's love. It's all one story of God's love. Cover to cover, book to book. It is all an expression of God's work in our life out of his love for us. And so, Job rested in that. Where death is your victory. Here's how what Job said is translated in the New Testament. Where death is your victory. Where death is your sting in 1 Corinthians. In light of this, we can give great thanks to God in the midst of suffering. We can have the same attitude as Job because death, even if death comes, it's not going to have an impact on the reality of what God is doing in my life. Right? This body can go because I have another one waiting. I have a new model. Got a new truck a few weeks ago. And it's nice to have the new model, right? It's got more bells and whistles. Well, it's got different bells and whistles. Actually, my old car had more bells and whistles, but it's got new bells and whistles. It's nice to have the new model. I got a new model waiting for me. It's going to be everything that I've ever dreamed of and everything that I've ever needed. Physically, my body will be perfect, right? No more wrinkles, no more broken ankles, no more bumped toes, no more loss of hearing, no more arthritis, no more pain, no more suffering, no more tears. Right? We are more than conquerors. See, that verse is talking about the outcome of our lives. We are more than conquerors through him who loves us. It's not talking about we have a victory over everything that's going on in our life here. It's talking about the ultimate victory of our life. That no matter what takes place here, ultimately, just like Job said, I will see him face to face. Right? Paul said it this way, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then. He said the same thing that Job said, but then face to face. I will see my Redeemer. Right? That should mean something to us as believers. That should motivate us. That should drive our affections. That should drive our direction. That should drive our faith. Job is an example of how to drive your faith in the right direction and honor God and move closer to him and love him more. That's what Job's life is about. It is an example of that. And so as we draw to a close, verse 28, 29 says this, if you say, how will we pursue him since the root of the problem lies with him? Then be afraid of the sword because wrath brings punishment by the sword, so that you may know there is judgment. And so here again, he's referring back to his friends, and he's saying, okay, the world will judge believers. They're going to condemn us. They're going to think that our faith is in vain. They're going to think that what we're doing has no real meaning, has no real outcome. I remember a guy telling me one time that people who believe in God, they're just using that as an emotional and psychological crutch and has no real value, right? And so, that's kind of what Job is referring back to here is that, you think that it has no real issue. It's he says, if what you say is true or what you believe about my situation is true, then you need to be in fear. Because I've lived a life that you've seen. And if the sword has come down on me because of the way that I live, then you better be afraid because you know the way you live. Right? So he's kind of pointing the finger back to them and say, okay, well, if what you say is true, then apply it to your own life. Right? And so he kind of pushes back on his friend. The difference between the world and the believer is that we have been forgiven, they have not. So while it is true that you may encounter the sword if you do wrong, the difference in the life of Job was that he had done no wrong, right? And the difference for us as believers is that we have been forgiven of our wrong. We're not going to face the wrath and the sword because we've been forgiven. So while in this state here, Job had done no wrong, and even though the mantra of the day was, you must have done some wrong and you need the punishment of the sword, the mantra for us is the same. You reap what you sow. Yeah, but here's the difference. I'm forgiven. Amen. I have an intervention in what is owed to me, right? Jesus' blood has been applied to my account. I am whiter than snow. I am forgiven. I am clean. I don't have to worry about the sword. My situation is different because, back to the reality that Job just mentioned, I have a relationship with my Redeemer. Right? That's an amazing thing. Okay. This passage provides a sobering warning for all of us concerning how we treat others. That is true. And specifically, a warning to be slow to judge others based on our perceptions. A clear hope in meeting God face to face should not only bolster our steadfastness and faithfulness, but should also prompt us to speak the truth to others, even warning them of what's to come. And so, again, our message shouldn't be one of judgment. Our message should be one of the gospel. We are not charged to judge anybody. We are charged to give the good news so that they too have the hope and the ability and the reality to know the Redeemer so that they can avoid the outcome of what lost people through the sword incur, right? So let's not be busybodies and judge people, especially other believers, right? I've said this before, we're not to judge. We can't be fruit inspectors. We can say this person claims to be a Christian, but I don't see any fruit, any evidence of that reality, right? Faith without works is dead. It's no faith at all. We can see those things, but we don't judge people who are at some point in their walk that God is doing in their life what God is doing in their life, and that's between them and God. That's the reality, right? So we should be edifying one another, building up one another in the faith, and loving one another. That's the charge for the church. That's the charge for the believers. And then when we do that, we strengthen each other so that we can go out and fulfill what God has charged us to do as a community, and that is to preach the gospel. That's our job. Not to be Job's friends. I've got some Job's friends. They're negative Nellies, right? They're always on the negative side of the fence, no matter what goes on. So the thing I need to do is just keep my mouth shut and love them, right? Right? I leave them to God. Right? Any questions, comments, additions, subtractions?
Do we have any idea of how many days or years this, I'll say, trial that Job?
I don't. I can do a little. I don't remember any scripture reference that tells us that. But yeah. But just the amount of time that it took for this dialogue and for these things to go on. We know it was for a little while. I mean, I don't know if it was months, months, or years, but it was a while. It was, to the point where Job had nowhere to turn but God. There was no other hope, no other option, nothing. Yeah, it was definitely, we could say for sure it was a few weeks. Yeah. It was
It's just an interesting thought that through it all,
yeah.
I've learned to trust in Jesus. Through it all, I've learned to trust in God.
Yeah. That's, again, the point of the exercise. Trials, tribulations, testing your faith. That's the point of them. Are we really going to trust God? Is our faith real? If our faith is real, is it deep? If it's not deep, what God's going to mature it, right? He's not looking for baby Christians. He's looking for us to mature in our faith. Paul chastised believers who were not moving forward in their faith in God. When you should be eating meat, you're still drinking milk. And so again, this is part of the process that God uses to mature us. Life experiences makes you grow up, don't they? Hard life experiences make you grow up faster, don't they? So that same principle that takes place on the physical side of our life, God uses on the spiritual side of our life to mature our faith. The school of hard knocks, right? Sometimes some of us are denser than others, and so we need more knocking around than others. Some of us are smart, and we learn quickly, right? Some of us are not. Yeah. So, I mean, again, but the reality is it's all out of God's love for us. See, that's the thing. Sometimes the world paints the picture of, you must have done something wrong, or God is a mean God. That's the other side of the equation. How could I love and trust and believe in a God who allowed these things to happen in my family or my life or with my child or with my health or with whatever? I've had people tell me that, I could never believe in a God that allowed babies to be murdered or, my loved one to die or whatever. I've heard that. And what they're missing is it is out of God's love for you that he is allowing these experiences to draw you to himself, right? And so it's back to that, a father loves you, a father's going to correct you, a father's going to work in your life to instruct you, a father's going to work in your life to grow you, to mature you, to build you, to equip you, all these things. God is doing that in our lives spiritually. All of those things, again, are for our good and for his glory. Any other comments? All right, we'll have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the example of Job. God, it is an amazing example. And Lord, it's much deeper than we give it credit for sometimes. And Lord, it is much more applicable to our life today than sometimes we allow. And so, Lord, I pray that you'd help us to consider it and to dwell on it a little bit, to think on it, meditate it, and learn from it, Lord. And may we be like Job. Lord, have you considered my servant Job? Is a stellar recommendation on the faith of your servant Job. And Lord, we pray that someday that can be said of us. We thank you for this day. We pray you bless it in your name. Amen.